Hey guys, second part of chapter 18. So last one we talk about women's education and college graduation as well. Education and industrialization gave women a voice in the public forum as they had done so in the early 1800s. Recall, this is the late 1800s. Women clubs re-emerged in the late 1800s to study problems such as pollution, unsafe working conditions, and urban poverty. The most successful reform movement was the WCTU, the Women Christians Temperance Union. The goal was to curb alcohol abuse by banning liquor sales. The WTCU vividly described the plight of abused women and children. It was the first club to identify and combat domestic violence. Francis Wheeler, who became the president of the WTCU, called for women's suffrage and an end to child labor. One of the most successful things that they accomplished, they established soup kitchens, libraries, they called for the 8-hour workday, and investigation of prison conditions. Now, while the WTCU main goal was to try to end alcohol abuse, there were people, prohibitionists, who grew support from city dwellers who considered that alcohol and crime were related, rural families who saw big cities as sinful, full of prostitutes, alcohol, and political corruptions. However, others condemned drinking on religious ground. That was their main goal. Frances Wheeler is the face of this club, and there she is. She, again, was the Women's Christian Union leader in the late 1800s. Everywhere she went and talked about this problem of alcohol, it seemed like alcohol was synonymous with poverty, hunger, unemployment, and other industrial problems. She also encouraged women to join the national debate over poverty and inequality in wealth. Most men were the wealthy ones, and most wealth rely on the elitists. The WTCU taught women to lobby, raise money, and run for office, and Frances Wheeler is an instrumental woman in doing so. Here is a picture of the movement. Again, Frances Wheeler right in the middle, in the center. Most of them were women, but you do see two male figures here, senators from Illinois. There's one, and there is the other. And they are supporting the the WTCU temperance movement. However, there were people who defended alcohol, including Germans and Irish, the businessmen, and the working class who saw saloons as a leisure and community place. While initially the WTCU was not very successful in the prohibition of alcohol, eventually the 18th Amendment did pass in the early 1900s and prohibit the sales of alcohol and liquor. Another major issue, since voting continued to be denied to women, women kept fighting for their right to vote. The National American Women's Suffrage Association, the NAWSA, National American Women's Suffrage Association, were successful in winning women's suffrage in Colorado, in Idaho, and in Utah. Remember, Wyoming was the first state to give women the right to vote. This map shows us that before 1909, the purple states had given women the right to vote. The blue states gave women the right to vote to a certain extent between 1910 and 1918. These orange-colored states gave women partial suffrage before 1919, and there was no women's suffrage in 19 in the eastern coast. So women's suffrage actually run from west to east. By 1913, most of women in the West had the right to vote, but many women and men alike were actually against women's suffrage. These become known as the anti-suffragists. They want to deny women the right to vote on the basis that voting would undermine women's special roles as disinterested reformers, that it would prove too expensive to give women the right to vote, that it would only double or worse yet cancel their husbands' votes. Anti-suffragists claimed that women were better off without the ballot. In response, extreme suffragists responded by becoming feminists, advocating for women's full political, economic, and social equality. Now, giving white women the right to vote did very little for black women. Ida B. Wells is an African-American woman who is very influential in particular, the lynching laws. So she is part of the National Association of Colored Women, which was established in 1896. Colored women had to establish their own associations because they were denied membership in white women association. So suffragists did not always agree with giving black women the right to vote or provide them with any aid. So the National Association of Colored Women advocated for orphan care, they founded homes for the elderly, they advocated temperance, again getting rid of alcohol, and undertook public health campaigns. Wells, in particular, called attention to the real reasons for lynching and to pass laws against lynching. See, Ida Wells had 3 friends, all who were African Americans, and had a grocery store in Memphis, Tennessee. An angry mob attacked the store of these 3 African Americans because they were competing against a white grocery store. The 3 African American owners actually defended themselves, wounding several of the attackers. However, a larger mob came back later, and the 3 African Americans were lynched. Ida B. Wells urged African Americans to then boycott the city's white businesses. She led anti-lynching campaigns because her investigations demised the idea that lynchings were a cause of interracial rape. Most of the men that were lynched were African American on the basis that they had raped a white woman. However, Ida B. Wells' report showed that the real issue for lynching was economic competition between blacks and whites, labor disputes, or the consensual relationship between a white woman and a black man. So she was able to help pass anti-lynching laws in the South eventually, but the damage had been done as well. So she was an African American woman fighting for African American rights for women and men. Booker T. Washington was an individual similarly like her. He was actually born into slavery before the Civil War ended. He founded the Tuskegee Institute, which provided industrial education for black men. Now, while he was promoting for a little bit more black equality, there was a particular speech that becomes known as the Atlantic Compromise Address that he gave in 1895, where to a certain extent, he actually advocated for submissive attitudes by blacks towards whites. As disenfranchisement, discrimination, and Jim Crow laws became the norm in the South, critics began to criticize Booker T. Washington for accepting white supremacy. That is obviously in the extreme. Booker T. Washington was trying to say that African Americans are good in doing labor work because that is their history as slaves, and that African Americans should be content with doing labor work. Modern African American young men actually wanted African Americans to rise to political educational power, something that Booker T. Washington didn't necessarily see eye to eye. And so that's why, while he was an advocate for African American equality, he did come under heavy criticism. Going back to women, because women did receive an education, because women did graduate college, because women did enter the labor force as white-collar workers, and they become teachers and nurses, they were active members trying to improve society, a new image of women appeared in what becomes known as the, quote, new woman, unquote. These were educated, athletic, and independent women. They're also portrayed in magazine, Charles Gibson magazine, that portray young, beautiful girls as educated and athletes, and these become known as the Gibson girls. Part of the reason why they become this new identity is because females marry later in life, they had fewer children, and they space pregnancies more widely. This picture here shows you this young female, she seems very assertive of herself. Notice how she also has a hat. She's actually in front of her husband. She's looking forward, very poised as to launch towards something new. So there was a new identity in women. There was, again, this Victorian age had passed, and the new woman was coming of age. Despite all this, there were certain things that there were still taboos. The Comstock Act of 1873 prohibited any circulation about sex and birth control in any means. So this idea that sex should be talked about in public was very taboo. Another reason why there was fewer children was because birth control did come around. Condoms, for example, were widely accessible now, but people didn't talk about it. The U.S. did continue to be a very religious country. Catholics and Jewish immigrants adopted U.S. customs, industrialization, and scientific discoveries to their new faith. Politicians argued that religion is in harmony with Republican values, and as such, religion continued to play a big role in not only immigrants' life, but also Americans. In response to the American Protective Association, who wanted all school teachers to be Protestant and to ban all Catholic political officials, Catholics established their own private Catholic schools to preserve their faith and culture. And to seek new converts, over 9,000 Protestant missionaries were sent overseas in 1915 to Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Some missionaries won converts by providing medical aid and education. Others seemed to act like imperialists rather than loving Christians. At home in the U.S., The Salvation Army spread the gospel by offering urban poor assistance, which ranged from soup kitchens to shelters for prostitutes. This act of Christian charity became known as a social gospel, that is, the renewing of religious faith through dedication of justice and social welfare. In this picture, you see two Protestant missionaries in Japan trying to convert these Japanese into becoming Christians. And according to these Christian missionaries, they are following the Bible verse of Mark 10:16, where Jesus tells his disciples to go throughout the world preaching the gospel. And recall, some of these immigrants that landed in the U.S. continue to practice this new faith. Besides putting faith in God, people began to put faith in science. With all the technological advances, education did challenge fundamental and religious ideas. No one more so than Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution or natural selection states that species whose traits adapt to the environment are most dominant, and as such, these dominant traits should be preserved as much as possible. Now, Darwin applied this theory to plants and animals only, but as industrialization became more widespread, some people actually applied it to people. And this becomes the social values. We have social Darwinism versus the social gospel. In social Darwinism, it argues the survival of the fittest. The person who has the best traits are going to survive. And in this particular case, during the Industrial Revolution, the elite and the wealthy seem to be the better than the working class. There was also this idea of eugenics, the science of human breeding, making kids. They argue, the eugenics argue that people with mental deficiencies, people that were in asylums, people that were considered insane in their lower class races, including Native Americans, Black, and Asians, must be sterilized to preserve the pure white race. In other words, they didn't want these people to have kids because that would create an inferior race, and so they wanted to prevent that. On the contrary, the social gospels, first of all, were Christian missionaries. They were spreading the Christian gospel, and their faith was a belief in God. They offer salvations to heathens, people without God, and so we see the social values of either science or religion, but either way, both of them play a major issue in terms of how society was viewed. Finally, we'll talk about realism. Realism, in its definition, is writing and painting daily life as exact as possible. Stories no longer needed to be of happy endings. People read true stories about factory lives, the struggles of survival, fear, suffering, and even death. Mark Twain wrote about racism and slavery, for example, in Huckleberry Finn. Jack London wrote about humanity's apathy towards one another, brought about industrialization. Nobody really cared about anybody else. They just care about making money. And John Sloan is the painter of this painting here. He painted New York tenements and the struggles of daily life. In this particular case, the struggles of a female, most likely working class woman, probably after work or before work, she's tending to her family. In this particular case, washing clothing. Realism also portrayed the dangers of industrial life, in this particular case, the dangers of steel production, coal mining, and in the West, women working also out in the fields. So realism comes to show the country the realities of life and the struggles of life, and people actually are attracted to some of these stories. And so some of these major writers and artists become very, very popular at this time, not in the US, but worldwide.